Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Truth. I'm your host, one you love the most, Niall Hessen, back with a brand new episode here in The Truth. Back once again with my boy AJ Ponciano. AJ, before the show, you said you hurt your back. How you doing today?
I'm doing alright. Just kind of not being able to move most of the day kind of sucks, but just sitting here with the heat pack on.
Hey, you know what? There's no better way to use the heat back than when you're recording a podcast. But yeah, I've messed with my back a couple of times on accident. How did you hurt your back?
Yesterday was the first time I've been on a mound throwing a pen in probably 2.5 months, roughly, from my shoulder injury, and pen went well yesterday, and then got home, laid down, and back immediately started to tighten up.
Really? I was hoping you were gonna say that you like deadlifted like 600 pounds and unfortunately just injured your back that way. But I guess that works as well. No, I've injured my back so many times I can't even count. But we'll talk a little bit more about your back maybe another time. Let's talk about fantasy football. We just had the first round of fantasy playoffs. How did that go for you?
Uh, so one of my leagues I had to buy. So first round for me is going to be this week. One of my other leagues are my Coastal League. It's a 2 week first round, so week 15 and 16 combined. And then our league, it was not good. Injuries, both with T Law and Derek Carr being out, hurt me. Tua didn't have a great week. I had so many guys on that Thursday night game that just didn't perform. I had Cooper Cup, Debo, Jawan Jennings, Fred Warner. Obviously, Cup had 0 points. Debo basically had 0 points. He had two drops, one of them that could have been for a big, like 30-yard play, and one of them that could have been for a touchdown.
Yeah, well, it's kind of looking at your leagues as a whole. Like I feel like there's the different the dynamics, right? You got the one where you have a bye, you have the one where you have a 2 week, which I actually prefer a lot. I do prefer 2 weeks just because, like, with fantasy, like it's so hit or miss. Like you could literally go 14-0, and then all your players just do nothing in that first week, and it's like I get it, it's part of football and it's the NFL, but that would really suck. And then obviously, yeah, that dynasty league a little bit of a rough ending, but hey, had a solid team. Injuries killed you. That's going to happen. But the good news is with dynasty leagues is you get to keep those guys next year. And I'm sure you have a couple draft picks that you can use. I have one fourth round draft pick this year, so I've exhausted all my draft picks trying to contend. So I was happy to win that league. I advanced in 3 of my 4 leagues. The only league I lost to my dad. I lost by like 170 to 130. Just absolutely crushed me. We're moving on. We'll be moving on in the next show. We still got takeaways that we're going to talk about here in week 15, which hopefully can help your fantasy teams here in week 16, progress to that next level. Hopefully, unless you're in a 2 week league, this could be your semifinal, get into your championship, or for some of those leagues that, are starting their postseason in week 16, right? This is your first round of playoffs. So it's an important week. These takeaways here, both for fantasy and the NFL, to kind of keep your eyes open to see kind of what you can do moving forward and what potential successes you could have to get you to that next step and be fantasy relevant and win that championship. So today we have our 5 takeaways from week 15. AJ, go ahead and give me your first takeaway.
My first takeaway is I get Josh Allen's having a great year. This is less fantasy relevant, but he should not be the MVP favorite at the moment. I think it should be Lamar personally, especially after this last week, having 5 touchdowns, 290 yards. I mean, he's top three in passing touchdown, or top five in passing touchdowns, top three in passing yards. He has 34 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, almost 3,600 yards, more rushing yards. Almost as many rushing yards, sorry, as last year when he won MVP. I get it's kind of voter fatigue. He has 743 rushing yards with 3 rushing touchdowns. Voting fatigue, like, are they really going to Lamar his third MVP? I get it. They want to change it up. Josh Allen's been having a great year, especially since him getting engaged with Haley. Uh, Ever since then, he's had a great year. But Lamar's been doing it all year. Been one of the best teams of the Ravens all year. I understand it. It's a great story having Josh Allen be the MVP, kind of being one of those guys who just couldn't get over the hump the last couple of years, mainly the interceptions. He's like 5 interceptions at the moment. He's having a great year, but for betting odds, him being right now the clear favorite at minus 900 is kind of crazy when Lamar Jackson is at plus 550.
So for me, yeah, I want to kind of touch on that note a little bit because I've seen a lot of debates about who the MVP is. To me, it's Lamar, and I think, yeah, Josh Allen has had a great couple of weeks, and I think a lot of people see just strictly the fantasy relevancy. But I feel like he was kind of sporadic, especially in the early parts of the year, whereas Lamar has consistently been dominant. I mean, as you mentioned, I have Lamar in the Dynasty League, and I've been waiting for that 1 week, hopefully not anytime soon, where he, has a down week, he has like 13 or 14 points, but every week he's pumping out like 35 fantasy points because he's doing it, throwing the football very efficiently, running when he can. And overall, I think he's the best player in the NFL. You mentioned the voter fatigue. It is a pet peeve of mine. I know voters get annoyed with, voting for the same guy, especially 3 times in a row. But at the end of the day, like that, your job as a voter is to vote for the best player. It's not to vote for who you feel, maybe deserves it more just because they're tired of seeing the same guy win it every year. I know there were some critics that maybe said that Lamar shouldn't have won MVP last year. But even if they said that, he's obviously made the case this year. I mean, think of Jokic in the NBA. I thought Jokic should have won a 3-time MVP. And I think maybe an example there is the voter fatigue. They're like, hey, let's see somebody else win it. Who's the next closest that you could be justified for, and that was Joel Embiid. So it is a real thing. I think there's been a debate about maybe running backs like Saquon or Derrick Henry. I just think the quarterback position is so valued, and I think Lamar Jackson's been playing at the highest clips throughout the season, and that's been his success moving forward. For me, my first takeaway, and this always seems to be a takeaway, particularly in the first round of fantasy playoffs, is what a week of superstars and disappointments. I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, like the Lamars, the Josh Allens, Amon-Ra had big games. But then look at two other key players, as you mentioned, Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill, completely AFK. Jalen Waddle, I didn't even know if he got a catch. I know he was injured for a period of time. He was out on the sideline there, but it seems to be every week in the first round of fantasy playoffs, like that first week, it's always superstars and disappointments. Like you could go out and throw, a guy like Cooper Kupp or even Puka Nacua, and they just are shut down for whatever reason. So that was disappointing. I think it kicked off with the Rams 49ers on Thursday night, how disappointing that game was. But it really just, brings back the idea of fantasy. Like we obviously all love fantasy. That's why we do it. But the disappointments that you get when your guys just completely let you down in the postseason, for some reason, always seems to happen to me. I'm sure it happens to most people as well. I just feel like I'm always the only one that's ever done with it. But it is how fantasy works, and that's why you got to get creative, and that's why you got to build those elaborate depth spots, and it can really help you, propel yourself forward. But then on the flip side, the superstars, as you mentioned, the quarterback play. I mean, tremendous. Allen, the league I lost to my dad, he had Josh Allen. I played it back-to-back weeks because I played him the last week of the regular season and first round of playoffs. That was a pain in my thorn. Lamar's been consistent. Amon-Ra kind of broke out in the game. Like those big time stars, I feel like they either did really great or really bad. And I know it's part of fantasy, but I feel like it's really more emphasized here as we're in the fantasy playoffs. And I think it's something that you really should just consider moving forward as kind of maybe being a bit skeptical about the future and what can happen. What about your second takeaway?
Sorry, excuse me. It's crazy how the Cardinals still don't know how to use Marvin Harrison Jr. Another week, another sub 50-yard game. 2 receptions, 32 yards. If I remember correctly, he only has 200-yard receiving games in the season. One against Miami, 6 receptions, 111 yards, a touchdown. 4 receptions, 130 yards, 2 touchdowns versus the Rams back in week 2. I mean, the amount of game logs he has where he has sub 3, sub 4 receptions, only 5 targets a game, less than 50 yards. It's crazy. So, one of the most dynamic wide receivers that we've seen come into the draft in years. I mean, he was the clear number one wide receiver. He would have been the number one wide receiver in probably the last 10 classes, wide receiver classes. He was the clear number one, drafted 4th overall, and he has sub 700 yards. He does have 7 touchdowns, but less than 50 receptions on the whole year. I mean, guys like Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr., Ladd McConkey, all have worse quarterback situations. I think Kyler is probably one of the best quarterbacks out of all of those. You can argue with Justin Herbert there, with Ladd McConkey, but even then, those are all guys that are drafted 10 picks at least after him. I guess Neighbors was 4 picks or 5 picks, something like that, after Marvin. But there was a gap there between wide receivers, and everyone thought Marvin was head and shoulders over everyone else. And you know what? He probably has been playing like that. Just I have zero idea if he has been playing like that because he doesn't have any stats to really back it up.
So for me, it kind of echoes my previous takeaway, but it really opens the question, at least to me. For top tier quarterbacks, is it important to draft them early in the draft? Because I've always kind of hesitated from that. I've always said, you can always get, especially in PPR leagues, you want to focus on receivers, tight ends, things like that. But really the last 2 weeks, especially, have really kind of opened my eye that, hey, maybe drafting a guy like Josh Allen or drafting a guy like Lamar Jackson in that first, even second round could prove to be the X factor. Because, yeah, okay, we're really emphasizing about Josh Allen, but his last 4 weeks, 24 points, 28 points, 51 and 41 points. I mean, that in of itself, that doubles those last 2 weeks, double even a good productive performance from a quarterback. So it really does open the question because, yes, quarterback is the most important position. I know obviously league scoring is different. Looking at it from that perspective, it really could reopen the question about what quarterbacks are important to draft and when are they important to draft. Because I've always been a big proponent to not. I always like to try to get, like the Justin Herberts, the Kirk Cousins of the world. And obviously that's working out great this year. But, I've always been kind of reluctant just because I feel like the quarterback play, especially these running quarterbacks, are so hit or miss. But recently I've been proven wrong the fact that Lamar, Josh Allen, some other guys that I just can't mention off the top of my head have had good success. And that really opens the question, at least for me and maybe some of you going into next year, is it worth it? And I think so, because if you're going to get production like this, now obviously you're not going to get production like this from Josh Allen and Lamar every week, but it's been consistent throughout the year, especially as of late when it counts. And even in the early stages of the year as well, it really opens the door to maybe, hey, this quarterback could basically play two positions. He can be two for the price of one, as opposed to going and getting a wide receiver like a Cooper Kupp or Tyreek Hill, who did bust and did nothing for my fantasy team. So it is something I think to open the door to at least going into next year. And I probably will echo it as the draft comes closer and closer. All right, what about your next takeaway?
That for wide receivers just going out to the media and complaining about not getting the ball, it works. I mean, right now in the playoffs, you hope that your number one wide receiver, number two wide receiver goes out into the media and says, I'm not getting the ball. I mean, we've seen it. AJ Brown just this past week, everything that's come out about basically Hurts and Brown not being friends anymore, essentially. So it seemed like comes out in this game, 8 receptions, 110 yards, a touchdown. Jordan Addison, we saw, I want to say, 4 weeks ago at this point. Next week against Chicago, 8 catches, 162 yards, a touchdown. Did have a down game, 4 receptions, 54 yards, but then 8 receptions, 133 yards, 3 touchdowns. Last week, 7 receptions, 63, still very nice and fancy value. I mean, also Calvin Ridley earlier this year. He didn't get a single target in the first half of one of the games, complained about it after the game. Next game, I think he had like 6 or 7 receptions for 90 yards and a touchdown. At this point, you're just hoping that your wide receiver, like you get a notification about him saying something dumb. Before, you don't want your wide receivers, fantasy players, you don't want any notifications about them because that usually means an injury. At this point, if it's a wide receiver, you're kind of hoping for some type of notification that he said something about his quarterback. He said something about not getting the ball because it seems like it worked. I mean, before everyone called him a diva, I always think of Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas complained like a couple times on Twitter. He was called a diva, but now guys are complaining to the media straight up, and they get the ball immediately afterwards. I think it's just kind of funny how much wide receivers are complaining, even though they're already having productive years and they were getting targets, just not just not getting receptions. But I guess you want your wide receivers to start complaining more.
Yeah, so for me, my next takeaway is what does the Lions running game look like with David Montgomery being absent? Obviously, David Montgomery, I guess, tore his MCL. He's out for the year, which is kind of interesting to note the fact that I remember watching him get injured, but then he came back into the game and played for the rest of the game. I think it was some point at the beginning of the second half, which is just crazy to think about. But again, goes to show like, I mean, technically he could have played on it. I know obviously adrenaline was kind of pumping through him, and that's going to definitely affect his ability to play. But it really opens the door of what is the next steps for this Lions team, because obviously the expectation is Jahmyr Gibbs is going to continue to have fantasy value, and I do believe so. But I don't think this is going to be so cookie cutter that Jahmyr Gibbs gets 30 touches every game. That's just not how Jahmyr Gibbs thrives, and that's not how Jahmyr Gibbs works. I like to think of maybe the comparisons back in the day with Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard. Obviously, when Zeke left, everyone was expecting Tony Pollard to kind of step up into that running back one role and have good success. And he had success, but not to the level that people were expecting, just because I feel like Tony Pollard really complemented Ezekiel Elliott well, just as the two Lions running backs complement each other well. So I think the Lions realize that. I think Ben Johnson realizes that. The biggest thing that I'm going to note moving forward is maybe it's worth picking up Craig Reynolds just to have on your bench, because I believe that's their next running back up. Now, will Craig Reynolds replace David Montgomery? No. But this Lions offense is super good. Just watching that Lions Bills game, I mean, points everywhere. they're going to obviously have an effective running game. That's their reasoning for success. If anything, you would hesitate more with Goff and players like that. The running game is their success, and they want to keep Jahmyr Gibbs healthy, especially since everybody in this Detroit Lions team seems to just be falling to the injury bug. The last thing the Lions team wants as they're Super Bowl bound and Super Bowl contending is to completely drop off the picture because of an injury to Jahmyr Gibbs, because then they're stuck with Craig Reynolds as their running back one. So I definitely think it's worth an add, especially if you're in a deeper league. Obviously, if you're still alive for points or the championship as well. Not saying it's going to make an immediate impact this week, but it is worth noting that going into the championship 2 weeks, it really could be a difference maker, and he could still be a really solid option. And I'm guessing there's not many people jumping on that train right now. But I think Jahmyr Gibbs will still do, the peak value. He'll get a little bit more uptake just because there's not really many more mouths to feed. But I do think it is worth noting that I think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be splitting time with some other running backs, maybe Craig Reynolds. I think they also have Sione Vaki on their roster. So those three running backs would not be surprised, especially Reynolds and Vaki, if they get up to what David Montgomery did before his injury. What about your next takeaway?
Rico Dowdle's him. I need one more week to really prove it. This is his third week in a row having 100 yards rushing, and which is the crazy part because 3 weeks ago, the first time he did, that was his first ever 100-yard rushing game in his career. The last 4 weeks, 19 carries, 84 yards, 3 receptions for 12 yards. 22 rush attempts, 112 yards, a touchdown, 3 receptions for 11 yards. 18 rush attempts, 131 yards, 1 reception, 10 yards. And last week, 25 rush attempts with 149 rushing yards. Granted, he only has 1 touchdown with that time, so you'd hope for that to go up, but I mean, he's just proving that he may be one of those last minute guys like Chuba Hubbard last year, where you're going to have to throw him into your starting lineup. Chuba Hubbard, I want to say the last 4 weeks of last year, last 5 weeks, very similar line as Rico Dowdle. Just a team that wasn't really in it. They just going to run the ball with their number one running back, just keep on feeding him. And that's what they've done with Dowdle. I think the biggest part about it is that he's had his lowest carries the last 4 weeks is 18, but his highest has been 25 that we just saw this past week. I mean, he's like I said, he's one of those guys like Chuba Hubbard who came just coming on late at the end of the year, and is someone that I feel like you have to start at this point. He's proven it that he's going to get the carries, he's going to get the workload, even in games that they seem like they're going to be close. I mean, that's kind of how it's been all year. Washington game, 34-26, New York 27-20, 27-20 against Cincy, and then even last week, it being a 16-point game, 30-14 against Carolina. He was still in there, still getting carries at the end of the game. I know Zeke had some carries. We haven't seen him in the lineup for a while, and some other guys got some carries, but that really doesn't matter when you got a guy like Dowdle who's getting 20 plus carries a game.
So for me, my fourth takeaway is defensive matchups could be an X factor. And my whole point of this is every point matters, right? I think a lot of people, including myself, like it seems like every catch, I'm looking at my fantasy, okay, how much points did I get, right? Because you're really trying to see every point and it mattering. And I think defense could be kind of an X factor as we get to the fantasy playoffs, particularly looking at the defensive matchups. I think a lot of people have been rocking with certain defenses. It's hard in the first half of the season to see which defenses are having success, which defenses you should add, things like that. But I've really kind of focused my attention in general to being a guy that uses defenses based off of matchups. Again, think to the Bengals game against the Titans. I picked up the Bengals defense because I saw they were playing the Titans, and they should have had 2 defensive touchdowns. But for some reason, that guy, as well as Jonathan Taylor, like to drop the football before they go into the end zone. And it ends up not working out for them. But they would have had 2 defensive touchdowns, and that could literally have been the difference in my game. I ended up, dominating that week just because I had a lot of players go off. But I think it is worth noting that as we move forward here, there's always going to be a defense on the market, especially early on in the fantasy waiver wire week, where you can pick up a defense and really have success and, get those extra points that you need and have a little bit more stability just because of the matchups that are going on. I understand not every matchup's going to work, right? That Tennessee game, they still put up, a good amount of points, but it's going to happen where your bad teams have good offensive weeks, but you're better off doing that as opposed to having a defense like the Lions or the Bills where, you're going up against a big high power team. You want to hold on to that defense, sure, but then you're in a game with 100 total points scored and you're, getting negative points for your fantasy team. So I think moving forward as we progress in the fantasy playoffs, it is important to kind of filter defenses strictly off of matchups. It really could be the difference between you winning and you losing. All right, what about your final takeaway?
Yeah, so I was looking at all the games and trying to just figure out the best way to say this. You guys know the meme where there's the Bugatti in the trailer park? That is Bijan Drake London on this Falcons offense. Bijan at this point, 1,512 yards, 9 total touchdowns. He has 54 receptions on 60 targets, which is outstanding. I mean, that's a 90% catch percentage. That is amazing, especially how the backfield and how much they use him in the receiving game. And 14 games, he already has more total yards, more rushing yards than he did all 17 last year. He already has more touchdowns than he had uh, in all 17 games last year. And then Drake London, he's already at a career high in receiving yards, 919, career high in receiving touchdowns at 7, career high in receptions at 78. He's been great all year. Same with Bijan, and that was just the best way I could explain this offense at the moment. Obviously, Kirk Cousins looked great early on. Everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, Kirk Cousins is back. He's going to be the MVP potentially," and he was playing like that for a little bit. But we've seen Kirk go hit one passing touchdown in the last 5 weeks. I want to say he has 7 interceptions in the last 5 weeks, something along those lines. I mean, just horrible ratio there. Not playing well. Defense actually played pretty well last night. I get it was against the Raiders, but it was a good defensive stop. They also got safety on the Raiders. The special teams was great. I want to say the Raiders started within their own 10. I want to say 3 different times off of punts. I mean, everything seemed good on that facet. Just this offense, it's Bijan and Drake London, and that's about it. Darnell Mooney put up a 0 this week for fantasy standards. A lot of people got burned by that. I didn't have any shares of him, but he was someone that I think a lot of people were expecting to be a good wide receiver 2 option. Drake had that touchdown. Bijan had over 100 yards. But yeah, that when I was thinking of this offense, what's the best way to explain it? I think that the Bugatti in the trailer park, that's what Bijan and Drake London are.
That's a good way of putting that. On top of that, just yeah, Kirk has not been playing well, and I feel like it's kind of a repeat for those Falcons players with all the quarterbacks they've had, whether it's Heineke, whether it's Ritter. Like offensive production is going to stagnate, especially when your quarterback is not playing at the level that he was expected to. My final takeaway is kind of one I've always repeated throughout the year, but especially now in fantasy playoffs, it's not really a takeaway, but it's just trusting your gut. I had a lot of questions of people asking me like different matchups, who I should start, who should I sit, things like that. And I will always give you the best answer that I think possible. But at the end of the day, it's your fantasy team and you got to trust your gut. I always give myself a 5 second rule. I count down, I say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And whatever name is stuck in my head, if I'm deciding between 2, 3, or 4, I go with it because that's the one I'm thinking. The more you overthink, the more you kind of, run out of spots there. You're going to struggle. And I think the biggest thing is when that happens, it's so devastating when you're wrong and you make the wrong decision. If you're confident and trust your gut and just believe, hey, this is the guy I want to start, whatever, it's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be fantasy, right? It's not supposed to be stressful. It is stressful at times, especially in the fantasy playoffs. But biggest thing that I'll say is to trust your gut. And the more that you're able to trust your gut, the better off you're going to be. Use the 5 second rule. Use whatever rule you got, but that's just the way that I've always done it. And realizing that these are informative shows to try to best benefit your fantasy teams, but we're not going to have the answers. We're right on a lot of things. We're also wrong on a lot of things. The biggest thing is take the intel, take everything that you've given, trust your gut, and hopefully you can bring home that fantasy championship. Unless you're in any of one of my leagues, then don't trust your gut. Do whatever I say, and I'll tell you the wrong things so that you fail. But no, I would never do that. It is funny. People always are like, all right, I know I'm going against you this week, but here's who would you start? I go, look, this is who I'd start, and this is why I'd start them. If you want to do it, great. If it works, great. If it doesn't, don't blame me. But should be fun as we progress here. But again, as we get closer to those fantasy championships, a little bit more stressful, a little bit contradicting. That's the wrong way to look at it. Thank you guys for listening to another episode here in The Truth. If you guys did enjoy it, make sure you follow The Truth on Twitter at TheTruthAs1 to stay up to date with the latest information regarding The Truth, including podcast dates, podcast uploads, and other important information you don't want to miss. Make sure you guys also follow The Truth on Instagram and TikTok at the.tt.truth. Are you looking to find a drink that offers peak hydration, raises your energy levels, speeds up your recovery, and keeps your mind sharp, defocus and memory? Look no further than Acid Rainwater. I'm excited to partner with Bloodline Sports, AZ, and Acid Rainwater, which focuses on peak hydration and productivity while also maintaining ecosystem-friendly product. Use code HESSON15, that's HESSON15 for 15% off every purchase. As always, I'm your host, one you love the most, Niall Hesson, joined once again by AJ Ponciano. Take care and good night.